What I'd like to do for my first video in this Learning Drupal 8 by Trial series is to attempt to create a module. I'm going to start really simple. I just want to create a module that sort of a hello world, a URL that we can navigate to that puts some content onto the page. It's kind of like the simplest thing that we could create. There's been a lot of changes though to some of the very basic things about how modules are made in Drupal 8. So I think this will give us a good chance to explore some of those. So the first thing we do is take a look at the Drupal file structure. You may have seen that this has changed a bit for Drupal 8, but in the latest checkout from Drupal 8, we now have this core directory, which contains all of the code, or most of the code that makes up Drupal core. There's still a couple of things here and there, but the vast majority of it is in this core directory, along with all of the core modules and themes. So now the modules and themes directories that are in the root of the Drupal codebase are where we're going to put our own custom code and the things that we download from Contrib. Whereas with Drupal 7 and everything prior, these directories tended to contain the code that was part of Drupal core and the modules that made up of Drupal core, and so we wouldn't want to put our own modules here because there's too much potential for confusion, hard to keep track of them when you're updating and so forth. I think this is a really huge win in terms of making Drupal easier to use out of the box. So you just put the modules where you would expect to put them. I've got modules directory. I've also got a custom directory here. I actually created this one. It didn't exist. And so I'm just going to start by creating a new directory to contain our module. For lack of a better name, I'm going to name our test module here Chad. We'll just say Chad. In Drupal 7, the next step would be to create a .info file. So you need a directory, a .info file, and a .module file. .info files are a little bit different in Drupal 8 though. They're now YAML files. We can find out more about this by taking a look at the change records for Drupal 8. If you go to drupal.org/list-changes, we can search. I'm just going to search for .info.yml or YAML. Hopefully this will pull up some useful information. Yeah, so right here it says info files are now .info.yml files. And if we click on that, it gives us a little bit more details about this change. See this in a couple of places throughout the Drupal core in the way that info files are changing and just sort of how we write some of these configuration files is now YAML. I think it's nice to see it being consistent across modules and themes and the CMI initiative and so forth. Other than that, for .info files personally, I don't see a big difference, but let's take a look at what this means in terms of writing a module. More information here. I'm just going to hop over and start hacking one together and see what happens. So I'll open up my directory and I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to call it chad.info.yml or .yaml. I'm assuming that the parameters here are mostly going to be the same. So I'll do name, we'll call it Chad, description, module, core, package. The big difference here being that the syntax is YAML syntax. So instead of the .ini file syntax we used in Drupal 7, where this would have been, for example, package equals custom, we now do package : custom. I was also looking at this change notice. One of the things that you'll see is that for things that become an array, kind of like dependencies so this is a really good example. The syntax is a little different. If our module was going to be dependent on other modules, we might do something like this. Dependencies, and then underneath it's a dash like so, and we can make it dependent on the node module and dependent on the block module if we wanted to. Another thing that I've noticed when playing with Drupal 8 modules is that there's now a new type parameter for info files. So I'm going to specify that this thing that I'm creating is of the type module. So that should get us a .info file. My guess is we probably can't actually enable this yet or do anything. We can take a quick look at our site though. If it's anything like Drupal 7, you need to have an info file and a .module file, even if the .module file is empty. Yeah, it's not showing up in the list there yet. So let's add a .module file, a new file, chad.module, and we'll just add a comment. Like so. Now let's see if it shows up. We'll refresh. I think that should get it to show up. Yeah, there we go. So our custom module is showing up under the package custom, name Chad. We see the description. This isn't really all of that different. It's just the syntax of that file. And then it's got the .yml extension. So I'm going to go ahead and enable the module, even though it doesn't do anything yet. There we go. We should be able to see that our module is now enabled. Yep. Excellent. Okay, now let's make it actually do something. What I'd like to do is make it so that you can navigate to the URL, mysite.com/Chad, and have it display some content on the page. Again, just a really simple hello world example. One of the things that's changed a lot in Drupal 8 is things are becoming more and more object oriented. And in that, we're moving towards even more of an MVC or model view controller paradigm. You'll see that a lot of things in Drupal 8 now have controller classes. There's a form controller, there's an entity controller. And from my understanding, it's now considered best practice to have your module's page callback be a controller, or rather a method on a controller. So let's go ahead and create the appropriate class that we need and see how all of that's going to work. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is take a look at the PSR0 naming standard that Drupal is using for location and placement of these PHP files that contain classes. You can read a little bit more about this at drupal.org/node/1929784, which has some basic documentation about the path naming conventions and how this whole PSR0 thing works. Effectively what it is it's an autoloader. It's a convention for a set of subdirectories and naming files within those subdirectories so that Drupal can automatically find your class and then load that file and instantiate your class on demand. If you remember in Drupal 7, in a .info file, you would see this a lot. Something like files equal test.inc. And then that test.inc file would contain a class that was maybe your tests or whatever the case. And this was part of Drupal's registry, where it would scan through and find all of those class files and keep a database that kept track of which file contained which PHP class, so that when you tried to instantiate a new object of that specific class, it would know where to find the code and how to load it. We don't do that anymore in Drupal 8. We now just follow the PSR0 convention, and then there's a autoloader in core that will take care of that for you. The convention's a little bit tricky though. It involves a lot of nested directories. Once you kind of have wrapped your head around it, it's pretty easy to remember. And this page I think does a pretty decent job of explaining it. But if I remember, it's going to look something like this. We're going to need a directory inside of our custom module named let's make a new folder. We'll call it lib. And then we need another new folder. This one gets the name Drupal. We're just following the pattern here. So lib, Drupal, new folder. This one's going to be module name. So lib, vendor, Drupal, project or module name, which is here. And then we're going to create a controller. So we'll put that in a directory named controller. So in the end, we end up with lib, Drupal, module name, Chad, controller. And we're going to put our controller, the code that contains our controller, the file, in this directory. So I get all of these subdirectories here, like so. I'll open that so you can see. And I'm going to create a new file there, and I'm going to call this Chad controller.php. And then this is just going to be a standard PHP file, and we're going to start creating our controller in here. So we need to do a couple of things. The first is we're going to need to declare a namespace for our controller. So I'm just going to namespace it to Drupal Chad controller. And we need to set, we're going to need some additional classes inside of this module just to do some really basic things. We need the controller interface that we're going to implement, and we're going to need the container interface for the dependency injection container. So we're going to use both of those. I'll just so this is what that looks like. This is just PHP syntax for here's the location based on namespace of the object which I'm going to be referencing in my code. So we've got our controller interface and then the container interface. So now we can start a new class. We'll make a new class called Chad controller, and we're going to implement the controller interface like so. So we're just going to implement this basic controller interface. The basic controller interface has just one method that we need to implement, and that's the create method. So I think we should be able to look up the documentation for this on Drupal.org just to get an idea of how this works. So if we go to org, we'll look at the controller interface. Yep, it's just got one static method, create, which is used to instantiate a new instance of this controller. This will get called for us automatically. This is just by convention in Drupal 8 that your controller implements a method named create. When Drupal instantiates that class or your controller, it's going to automatically call this create method and do whatever you are taking care of inside of that. So the simplest thing that we can do, and it looks like it takes one argument, the container here, which is the dependency injection container. So we'll update our method signature like so, and then we just need to return a new instance of our controller object. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to say return static container. Like so. This is just a simple example of a create method so that our controller can be instantiated using the dependency injection container, and we're getting the module handler service and returning that. The next thing I'm going to do is implement a method that will be essentially our page callback. So I just do something like public, like so, and we'll just build a render array and return that. So this part is the same type markup. There we go. So we've now got a method that just builds a really simple render array that will be returned from our controller. The last step to all of this is setting up a route so that when somebody navigates to a URL, Drupal knows how to invoke this method. In Drupal 7, we would do that using hook menu. This has changed in Drupal 8 though. It's a little bit interesting right now. It seems that hook menu still works, but the new convention is to use a routing.yaml file to define your routes, and that will become the standard. And as all of the code and core moves to this new standard, the ability to specify a page callback inside of hook menu will be removed. So consider that functionality deprecated as far as I know at the moment. Let's take a look at the documentation for this routing. I'm going to again just take a look at the change list, and we'll just search for routing and see what comes up. Here's the record that I'm looking for, is this new Symfony-based routing system. This does a pretty decent job of explaining effectively what we need to do is create another .yaml file, so module name .routing.yaml file inside of our module's root directory that defines patterns or URLs, really, the pattern that should be matched and then mapped to a specific method on our controller. That's explained a bit in this key differences area here. So we'll start by creating a module.routing.yml file, and then we'll define a machine name or a base name for our route, and then a pattern. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Back in our module directory, I'm going to create a new file named chad.routing.yml. I don't know, I just look at these examples and see what they do here. So this is a really simple example of how you would do this in hook menu. Here's your URL, here's the page callback. It's going to call that PHP function when somebody navigates to this URL. And here's the way that we do this now in Drupal 8. So we need to give our route a name. I'm guessing there's a naming convention here, and it's probably name of your module _ route name. Let's see. Yeah, routes are identified by a machine name. By convention, machine names should be prefixed with the name of the module that defines them. Okay. And then we've got a pattern, which looks to be the URL that we want someone to go to. Defaults, and then under defaults is this content, which appears to tell it the controller to instantiate and the method on that controller to call once it's been loaded, and any permissions that are needed in order to, I guess, view that page, probably akin to access arguments from Drupal 7. So this probably looks like this. We'll give it a name following the naming convention. So Chad _ and then just some machine name. We've got a pattern, and our pattern is just going to be Chad. I also noticed that these URLs now include the leading slash, whereas in Drupal 7 you would always leave out that leading slash. Then we specify defaults, content, and then the controller, and on that controller the method that we would like to call. Now this, when I first looked at this, I thought that this was just the same as the PSR0 naming convention, but it's actually a little different. It's close, but what we're doing is using the namespace here. So if you look at our chad controller.php, we've got this namespace that we declared at the top of the file. I'm going to include that in my route, like so. And then the name of our controller, and the method on that controller that I want called when somebody navigates to this pattern. Finally, we can add requirements for this route, and we'll just add a permission requirement of view content, because why not? Okay, so all that's in place. What this should do is when I navigate to the URL /chad, it should automatically find and include this chad controller.php file because of the PSR0 naming convention, and then instantiate this chad controller and call our chad page method, and then return some content. Let's see if this all works. I'm going to guess that we need to clear the cache before any of this will work. So I'm going to go to configuration, development, performance, clear all caches, and then I'll just attempt to navigate to our page. Oh, and it's not working. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on here. All right, my error log says that I've got an error in chadcontroller.php on line 11. Let's take a look at that. Controller.php, line 11. It's an unexpected opening parenthesis. So let's do this. What it is I was calling this function static, but I actually need to declare a new object of the type static, pass in this parameter, and return that. So that should take care of it. Let's see what happens when I refresh now. All right, there we go. So we're at our URL, and we're seeing the text, hello world. Not too bad. Quite a bit different than how we approach this in Drupal 7, though similar concepts, the actual execution is a lot different. So The .info file, for example, we needed a .info file to tell Drupal about our module. Same thing in Drupal 8. The syntax is different though. It's now a YAML file instead of our .info file, which was just Drupal's custom variant of the PHP INI syntax. We had to include this blank.module file. We're not actually doing anything with it now, but in order for Drupal to even recognize our module, we had to have that. Then we created a controller and a route. Similar to Drupal 7, where we would create a route or a menu item with a page callback. And effectively what we're doing is trying to map a URL to a PHP function to call. Same thing in Drupal 8, though the mechanics are different. We create a routing.yml file, define a pattern or a route, and then when that pattern is matched, call this method on this controller. So we're still mapping a URL to some PHP code that gets executed and returns a renderable array, and that code is here in our controller. Not too bad. That's what I got for this time around, and hopefully we'll be able to take a look at some more of the code changes in Drupal 8 in the near future.